The steel door behind the wallpaper opened with a hydraulic hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the Adirondack wilderness. 26-year-old Hannah Mercer stood in the hunting lodge's master bedroom at 3 in the morning, her headlamp illuminating a vault the size of a walk-in closet, and understood that everything her stepmother had said about her being worthless was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. But that discovery was still 9 days away. The letter from Marion Calder, her stepmother, arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-October, delivered to Hannah's studio apartment in Syracuse, New York, the apartment she'd managed to keep for 7 months working 3 jobs at 56 hours weekly. The apartment that cost $875 monthly and represented the first stability she'd known since her father's death 18 months earlier. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive stationery, and the message inside was typed in the cold, corporate font Marion preferred for all communications. Hannah, your father's estate has been fully settled. Per his revised will, dated March 2022, 18 months before his death, you are no longer named as beneficiary to any property, investments, or assets, with one exception: the hunting lodge at Caribou Lake, Adirondack Park, New York. The property has been assessed at $34,000 and requires immediate attention to avoid condemnation by the county. Property taxes are current through December, except within 30 days or the property reverts to the estate. Marion Calder, estate executor. Hannah sat on her apartment floor, her back against the wall, and read the letter 4 times. Her father, Daniel Mercer, had been a civil engineer who'd built a successful consulting firm over 30 years, with assets that included a home in Pittsford worth $680,000, investment accounts totaling approximately $1.3 million, and the hunting lodge, a property he'd inherited from his own father and visited twice yearly for solitary fishing trips. Hannah had been there once as a child, remembered it as dark and cold and smelling of mothballs. Marion had entered their lives when Hannah was 22, a widow herself, 15 years younger than Hannah's father, beautiful in a sharp-edged way that felt more like armor than warmth. She'd brought 2 adult children from her previous marriage and a lawyer who'd convinced Daniel to restructure his estate for tax purposes. Hannah had been in her final year of college, focused on her degree in museum conservation, and hadn't paid attention to the legal maneuvering until it was too late. When Daniel died suddenly of a heart attack at 61, Marion had inherited everything except the lodge. The house, the investments, the business, all transferred to Marion and her children through the revised will and a series of trusts Hannah's own attorney said would cost $40,000 in legal fees to even challenge, with no guarantee of success. Hannah had received $5,000 from a life insurance policy that predated the marriage and the hunting lodge she'd never wanted. She fought anyway, spent $3,200 on an attorney named Roger Stedman who reviewed the documents and explained that her father had been of sound mind. The will was properly executed, and unless Hannah could prove undue influence, difficult without concrete evidence, she had no case. Marion had been meticulous. Every signature was witnessed, every document notarized, every legal requirement satisfied. The $5,000 had lasted 4 months. Hannah worked as a prep cook at a restaurant, a weekend retail clerk at a bookstore, and did freelance archival work for historical societies when she could find it. She'd lost 12 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. Her savings account currently held $1,847. Her museum conservation career was on hold. The field required unpaid internships she couldn't afford and graduate degrees that cost $60,000. She'd applied for 16 positions in her field, all rejections. Marion had called once, 6 months after the funeral, to inform Hannah that she was welcome at Thanksgiving if she could behave appropriately and accept reality. Hannah had hung up. Now, holding the letter about the lodge, Hannah called the Adirondack Park County Assessor's office. A clerk named Judith explained that the property at 847 Caribou Lake Road was listed as a single-family dwelling built in 1948, last occupied 2019, with structural issues noted in the most recent tax assessment. The access road was private and unmaintained. The nearest town was Tupper Lake, population 3,500, 43 miles south. The property was zoned residential but located in the Forever Wild Preservation Area, meaning development was severely restricted. Honestly, Judith said, her voice kind but matter-of-fact. At that location and condition, you'd be lucky to get $20,000 in a sale. Most buyers want lakefront with road access and modern utilities. This is rough country, especially heading into winter. Hannah thanked her and ended the call. She looked around her apartment. The single room with kitchenette, the bathroom with the leaking shower, the windows that rattled when trucks passed on the street below. She looked at her bank statement on her laptop screen. $1,847. Her rent was due in 9 days. She loaded her 2011 Subaru on Saturday morning with everything essential: winter clothes, sleeping bag, camping stove, 2 weeks of groceries, her laptop and backup drives containing years of research and portfolio work. The drive from Syracuse to Caribou Lake took 4.5 hours. The last 90 minutes on progressively smaller roads through dense forest that was already showing the stripped, skeletal look of late autumn. The turnoff to Caribou Lake Road was marked by a rusted sign barely visible through overgrown brush. The road itself was gravel for the first mile, then became 2 dirt tracks through the woods, rutted and washed out, lined with maples and birch that scraped the car's sides. Hannah passed one boarded-up cabin, then nothing but wilderness for 3 miles. The hunting lodge appeared suddenly as the trees opened into a clearing, a large, 2-story structure built from dark timber and river stone, with a steep roof designed to shed snow and a wraparound porch that sagged on the left side. Several windows were broken. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. The whole structure leaned slightly, as if the earth beneath it had shifted and the building had simply given up fighting gravity. Behind the lodge, Caribou Lake stretched gray and cold beneath overcast sky, maybe 2 miles across, surrounded by mountains already dusted with early snow. The isolation was absolute. No neighbors, no power lines, no sound except whine through the pines and the distant call of a loon. Hannah parked, turned off the engine, and felt the cold immediately. It was 41 degrees outside, dropping fast as afternoon faded. She sat for a long moment, staring at the building her father had loved, the building that represented her entire inheritance, and felt something close to despair. Then she grabbed her flashlight and went inside to see what Marion had left her. The hunting lodge's interior smelled of rot and mouse droppings and something else, a deeper decay that spoke of structural failure and water damage that had been progressing unchecked for years. Hannah's flashlight swept across a large main room with a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, exposed beam ceiling, and furniture covered in moldering sheets. The wooden floor was buckled near the windows where rain had come through. The walls were paneled in dark wood that made everything feel like a cave. She spent the first hour doing assessment, moving through rooms methodically like she'd been trained in her conservation coursework. The kitchen was a disaster. 1960s appliances, no running water because the well pump had died, cabinets full of mouse nests. The bathroom on the first floor had a cracked toilet and a bathtub stained with rust. The second floor contained 4 bedrooms, all in various states of decay, and a storage area packed with her grandfather's hunting equipment, her father's fishing gear, and boxes of documents that had been chewed by rodents. The master bedroom was the largest room, facing the lake, with windows on 2 walls, 3 of them broken, covered with plastic sheeting that had torn loose and flapped in the wind. The floor here was worst, boards soft with rot in the corner near the bathroom. But the fireplace was intact, and when Hannah examined it, she found it was gas-powered, connected to a propane tank she'd seen outside that might or might not still have fuel. She tested it. After several tries, it ignited with a whoosh, and heat began to fill the room. Hannah set up her sleeping bag near the fireplace, ate a cold meal of bread and cheese, and spent the evening going through the boxes in the storage area by flashlight. Most of it was junk, old magazines, broken equipment, tax records from the 1970s. But in the bottom of the third box, she found a leather journal that had belonged to her grandfather, Kenneth Mercer, dated 1985 to 1987. The entries were sporadic, mostly notes about fishing conditions and weather, but 3 pages in the middle were different. March 1986. Daniel doesn't understand why I keep this place. Says it's a waste, that I should sell and invest the money properly. But he's young, focused on building his career, proving himself. He doesn't understand yet that a man needs a place that's entirely his own, where the world can't reach him. I've made certain this place will serve that purpose in ways he can't imagine. The renovations are complete. Only I know the full extent. August 1986. Tested the system today. Perfectly concealed. Even if someone lived here year-round, they'd never find it without knowing exactly what to look for. I've created the documentation, stored it properly. When the time comes, if it comes, everything will be clear. November 1987. My health is failing. The doctors say perhaps 5 years. I've decided to tell Daniel about the property, but not about the modifications. He'll understand when he needs to understand. Some knowledge is a burden until circumstances make it a gift. Hannah read the entries 3 times, then searched the storage area for anything else her grandfather might have left. She found nothing. No other journals, no maps, no documents that explained the system or modifications. She spent the next day making the lodge minimally habitable, sealing broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape, clearing mouse droppings, testing the propane tank, which turned out to be 3/4 full. The well pump was dead, so she'd be hauling water from the lake, boiling it for safety. The nearest grocery store was in Tupper Lake, 43 miles of bad road away. She had maybe 10 days of food, $1,647 in her account after paying for gas and supplies. At night, she sat by the fireplace with her laptop running on battery power, researching her grandfather's background. Kenneth Mercer had been a mechanical engineer who worked for Grumman Aerospace in the 1960s and 70s, retired early, spent his later years managing rental properties in Albany. Stable, conventional, not the type to create mysterious hidden systems in hunting lodges. Unless there was something she didn't know. On the 3rd day, Hannah began systematic examination of the lodge's structure, looking for anything unusual. She found oddities. A section of the basement ceiling that was reinforced with steel beams, excessive for a residential structure. An electrical panel that showed signs of having been modified, though there was no power to the building. A propane line that ran into the master bedroom wall and seemed to dead end, though she couldn't find where it terminated. On the 5th day, she started removing the wallpaper in the master bedroom, which was peeling anyway and revealing water damage. The paper was old, a dark floral pattern that made the room feel claustrophobic. She worked methodically, stripping it away section by section. Behind the wallpaper on the north wall, she found the seam. It was barely visible, a hairline crack in what appeared to be wood paneling, but felt different when she pressed it. Harder, cooler. She ran her fingers along the crack, found it traced a rectangular shape approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. When she pressed on the right edge, she heard a click, mechanical and precise. Nothing happened. Hannah spent 2 hours examining the panel, pressing different points, looking for a secondary mechanism. Finally, she noticed a small metal plate near the floor, partially concealed by baseboard. When she pulled the baseboard away, she found a keypad, 4 buttons, numbered 1 through 4. She sat back on her heels, heart pounding. A combination lock, hidden behind wallpaper in a hunting lodge, installed by a man who'd worked in aerospace engineering during the Cold War. Her grandfather's journal had mentioned documentation stored properly. She went back to the boxes, searched more carefully. In the very bottom of the last box, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a single index card with 4 numbers written in her grandfather's hand. 1-9-4-8. The year the lodge was built. Hannah entered the combination on the keypad. The panel clicked again, then hissed, a pneumatic sound that suggested pressurization, sophisticated seals, something far more complex than simple carpentry. The panel swung inward, revealing darkness and the glint of metal in her flashlight beam. She stepped through into a climate-controlled vault, lights flickering on automatically, and stopped breathing. The room was 12 feet square, lined with industrial shelving. On those shelves sat rows of archival boxes, each labeled with years and categories. And in the center of the room, on a workbench, sat an open case containing stacks of bonds, bearer bonds, negotiable instruments that had been common in the 1970s before being largely phased out. Hannah picked up one bond with shaking hands. U.S. Treasury, issued 1974, face value $10,000, matured and redeemable. The case contained 300 bonds. She opened the first archival box. More bonds, plus stock certificates. Physical certificates from companies she recognized. IBM, General Electric, AT&T, all issued in the 1960s and 70s, all registered to Kenneth Mercer. She opened 6 more boxes at random, all similar contents. The documentation was in the last box, a letter in her grandfather's handwriting. To whoever finds this, I built this vault in 1986 to preserve wealth I'd accumulated through careful investment and a career in defense contracting. I distrusted banks after the inflation of the 1970s nearly destroyed my savings. These instruments are legal, purchased with legitimate income, documented in the accompanying records. The total value as of 1987 was approximately $870,000. With matured interest and stock appreciation, the current value should be substantially higher. I intended to tell Daniel about this on my death, but I passed suddenly, and he never knew. The property was willed to him with the hope he would eventually discover what I'd hidden. If you found this, it means the lodge has stayed in family hands, and you were clever enough or desperate enough to look beyond the obvious. Consider this wealth not a windfall, but a foundation. Use it wisely. Kenneth Mercer, 1987-inch Hannah stood in the vault, her flashlight beam cutting through the controlled air, and felt her entire body start to shake, not from cold, but from the sheer magnitude of what she'd found. Her grandfather had hidden a fortune in this decaying lodge. Her father had never known, and Marion, in her greed to claim everything else, had discarded the one property that actually mattered. Hannah sat on the vault floor until the motion sensor lights clicked off, then turned them back on by waving her hand, and began the careful work of documentation. She photographed every bond, every stock certificate, every page of her grandfather's records. She uploaded everything to encrypted cloud storage using her laptop's remaining battery and the cellular hotspot she'd purchased in Tupper Lake that barely reached this far into the wilderness. Then she sealed the vault, replaced the baseboard, and drove 4 hours to Syracuse. The next morning, she walked into the offices of Morrison Financial Services, a wealth management firm her research indicated had experience with legacy assets. She requested a meeting with a senior partner and was told to make an appointment. She calmly placed one bearer bond, face value $10,000, matured in 1984, on the receptionist's desk and said she had approximately 300 more, plus vintage stock certificates, and needed immediate consultation on redemption. She was in a conference room with 2 partners within 15 minutes. Over the next week, Hannah learned that her grandfather's hidden fortune had grown substantially. The bonds, with accumulated interest, were worth $4.2 million. The stock certificates, most of which had split multiple times and appreciated over 4 decades, were worth an additional $3.8 million. The total value of the vault's contents, $8 million. The redemption process would take time. Bearer bonds required careful verification. The stock certificates needed to be converted to modern electronic form, and everything required documentation proving legitimate ownership and inheritance. But Morrison's partners specialized in exactly this type of situation, and they were confident they could have the majority of funds accessible within 90 days. Hannah retained an attorney, Margaret Sullivan, who specialized in estate law. Together, they documented everything. Her grandfather's will leaving the property to her father, her father's will leaving the property to her, the chain of title, the documentation her grandfather had left in the vault. Margaret was blunt. Marion will contest this. She'll claim the fortune should be part of your father's estate, that the will's exception for the lodge didn't include its contents. Can she win? No. The property and all contents were legally willed to you. Your grandfather's documentation proves the fortune predated your father's ownership. He inherited the property, but never knew about the vault. Marion has no legal claim, but she'll try, and it'll cost her legal fees to fail. Margaret was right. Marion filed a challenge in December, claiming the vault's contents constituted hidden assets that should have been disclosed during Daniel's estate settlement. The case was dismissed in February after Hannah's attorneys provided Kenneth's documentation, the proof that Daniel had never known about the vault, and the clear language in Daniel's will leaving the hunting lodge at Caribou Lake and all appurtenances thereto to Hannah. The dismissal included a finding that Marion's challenge was frivolous, and she was ordered to pay Hannah's legal fees of $18,000. Hannah didn't attend the hearing. She was at the lodge, overseeing renovations. With secured loans against the pending redemptions, Hannah hired a local contractor named Robert Chenoweth, who specialized in historical preservation. Together they rebuilt the lodge properly. New foundation work, structural repairs, replaced windows, updated systems while maintaining the building's character. The vault remained, but Hannah added secondary security and climate control improvements. She hired a well company to drill deeper, installed solar panels and battery systems, added a modern septic field. She kept the stone fireplace, refinished the original floors, restored the wraparound porch. The total renovation cost $340,000 and took 7 months. In June, with the lodge restored and the majority of her inheritance accessible, Hannah made several calls. First, to the director of the Adirondack Museum, offering to fund a new conservation lab in her father's name. Second, to Roger Stedman, the attorney who tried to help her contest Marion's takeover, with a check covering 3 times what he charged her, along with a note thanking him for being honest about her chances rather than stringing her along. Third, she called Marion. "The lodge has been restored," Hannah said when Marion answered, her voice still carrying that brittle superiority. "I thought you'd want to know that the property you assessed as worthless is now appraised at $620,000. "Good for you," Marion said coldly. "I'm sure you're very proud of your little renovation project. Some of us are managing real wealth. I also thought you'd want to know that I found something grandfather Kenneth left behind. A vault, with bearer bonds and stock certificates worth approximately $8 million. The silence on the line was profound. "You're lying. The case was adjudicated in February. You would have received notification if you'd been paying attention to anything beyond your appeal. The judge found your challenge frivolous. It's a matter of public record." Marion's voice, when it came, was shaking. "That fortune should have been part of your father's estate. It wasn't. It predated his ownership. He never knew about it. And it was explicitly willed to me along with the property. Your attorneys already tried this argument. They failed." Hannah paused, then added, "You told me I was worthless, that I needed to accept reality. I have. The reality is that you spent 18 months manipulating my father, restructured his estate to cut me out, and handed me the one thing that actually mattered. Grandfather Kenneth built that vault because he understood that real security isn't about controlling everything. It's about having something no one can take from you. You taught me that lesson more thoroughly than he ever could have." She hung up before Marion could respond. By August, Hannah had established the Daniel Mercer Conservation Fund with an initial endowment of $500,000, providing grants for museum professionals pursuing preservation careers. She'd purchased a small apartment in Syracuse for when she needed city access, but spent most of her time at the lodge, where she'd converted the second floor into a private conservation studio. She took on freelance projects, authenticated documents for historical societies, and taught occasional workshops at the Adirondack Museum. The work paid modestly, but money was no longer the point. She learned something in those months of living on $1,847, working 3 jobs, sleeping in an apartment with rattling windows. She learned she could survive the absolute worst, that her worth wasn't determined by bank balances or other people's validation. The fortune her grandfather left her was security, freedom, the ability to work meaningfully without desperation. But the person who'd driven to Caribou Lake with everything she owned in a 15-year-old Subaru, that person was the real inheritance. In September, she received a letter from Marion's attorney, a terse notification that Marion was selling the Pittsford house and relocating to Arizona, that all matters related to Daniel's estate were considered permanently closed. Hannah filed the letter away and went back to work. On a cold afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after receiving Marion's dismissive letter about the worthless lodge, Hannah stood on the restored porch, looking out at Caribou Lake. The aspens were gold against dark pines, the water was glass smooth, and smoke from her fireplace rose straight into crystalline air. Her phone rang, a curator from the Smithsonian, calling about a collaboration on a collection of Civil War documents that needed expert analysis. Hannah discussed the project details, accepted the commission, and ended the call feeling the satisfaction of work that mattered. She'd been kicked out, discarded, told she was nothing by someone who measured worth in possessions and control. And she'd driven to this isolated place expecting another loss, another confirmation that the world was designed to crush people like her. Instead, she'd found that her grandfather had understood something essential, that real wealth wasn't about accumulation, it was about foundation. The ability to stand firm when everything was taken, to rebuild when the structures collapsed, to recognize value where others saw only decay. The lodge was worth $620,000 now. The fortune in the vault had transformed her life. But neither of those things were why Hannah woke every morning in this wilderness refuge feeling something close to peace. She'd survived the worst. She'd proven she could build from nothing. And she'd learned that the people who try to convince you you're worthless are usually terrified you'll discover they're wrong. Hannah went back inside, closed the heavy door against the October cold, and sat down at her desk to begin work on the Smithsonian project. Outside, the Adirondack wilderness stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent and perfect. The same wilderness that had looked like exile 1 year ago, and now felt like exactly where she was supposed to be. The hunting lodge her grandfather built, the vault he concealed, the fortune he preserved. All of it had been waiting for someone desperate enough to look beyond the obvious, clever enough to solve the puzzle, and strong enough to deserve what they found. Marion had called the property worthless, and in doing so, had handed Hannah the one thing worth having. Proof that her judgment of people was as flawed as her understanding of value. Some lessons cost $8 million to learn. Marion had just paid for Hannah's, and Hannah had emerged from the transaction wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. That was worth more than any inheritance.